Hello, everyone. How is everyone today? I realize I didn't straighten my screen before I sat down today. Well, it is a beautiful, beautiful day here. It's post-ice storm. A lot of people, not so much in Toronto, but in the area around Toronto, are without power. One of them is my parents. But today was a absolutely beautiful day. And unfortunately, there's more freezing rain on the horizon. And I see we have lots of people in the chat already. John from Cape Breton, hello there. Jessica Rhymes from Chicago. Gladys is here from Texas. Jesse W. from Suwanee, Georgia, I believe is how you pronounce it. Michelle Etier from Iowa. Lynn Jones from California. I love that I've actually met so many of you. You're not just names and handles. Between QuiltCon and the cruises and trips that I've been on, I've been able to meet, and of course Karen's quilt crew, we've been able to meet, and it's just so lovely knowing you personally. Boy, we've got everybody from right across the country, from Colorado and California to Cape Breton Island. I'm just looking to see whether we've got anybody from overseas. Somebody from Missouri. Hello, Patricia. And Patricia, another Patricia from Columbus, Ohio. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. It has been a busy month. Last month, I was able to make 4 videos, 2 Karen's Quilt Circle and 1 Q&A, plus we had the class. So I was just talking with Gina earlier. We had a lot going on here. And so glad so many of you participated in it all. And there's just one thing I wanted to say first was if you watched my video on chippy chains, that was that beautiful rainbow potato chip quilt. There was one problem with one block. Unfortunately, it's not a good idea to be doing your final edit at 3 o'clock in the morning, but unfortunately that's where it was, and I missed it, just totally missed it. So I did revise it in the handout pattern, so just take a check and make sure you've got version 2, or I'm not sure if I called it 2 or just 1.2. And I blurred out the offending block in the actual video. So just to keep you on track, here I said it was so important to keep your blocks in the right spot, and I was leading you wrong with one of them. So if I ever update a pattern, I will say version 2 or the date that I updated it, because I know I've made a number of updates to the quilting sheets where you decide how many blocks you need to make a quilt, because different sizes have been used. Sometimes there's just been a typo error in one of them. So always feel free to just check and see whether there's been any updates to any of the patterns. Just going to start with the first question from Instagram. It looks like Mama Tice. She says, I have seen many videos that say that you should have your elbows at 90 degrees when sitting at your machine to sew. How do you feel about that advice? So what they're really trying to tell you is to get out of your shoulders, because if the angle is higher, then your shoulders come up like this, and we end up leaning over and something like that. What you want to do is to have your arms just hanging from your shoulders. You don't want to have too much pressure on them at all, and then just be using your hands to feed the fabric. So 90 degrees is about the sharpest that you could have it. You should probably even have it just a little bit high, the angle just a little bit higher, because your hands actually end up going a little bit higher than the 90 degree. But that's often hard to do, because if you get it 90 degrees for your hands, that might mean that your legs are out of alignment. You're supposed to be, your back and your hips are supposed to be at 90 degrees, and your knees are supposed to be at 90 degrees. So it's always a negotiation because very few of us are the standard size that these tables are made for. I had to actually get a higher chair, and I have my pedal sitting on a yoga block just to try and maintain that. But there are days when I just barrel through. But the trick is just release those shoulders, keep your neck high, and use your eyes to look down at your work. Just keep your body in better shape. That's really what it's about. And the same goes true for your cutting table and for your ironing board. You also want those at the 90 degree. Frankel123 has asked thoughts on washing versus not washing. Well, this is just one of those questions. We've got some big divides in quilting, and washing versus not washing is one of them. So a vote for not washing means that you can start into a project right away. You don't have to wait for things to dry. Sometimes the colors can stay brighter depending on how you wash them. And in quilting, the grain and keeping it square is not as important as it is for garment sewing. If you were buying fabric in the 1960s or 50s, even the 70s, there were chemicals that were left on fabrics that you would want to wash to get them out. These days, the chemicals are not quite so harsh. People still have sensitivities, so if you have a sensitivity or somebody in your family has a sensitivity, you'll want to wash them. I have started washing mine. I haven't pre-washed all my stash. I'm doing it project by project, but I'm just finding my personal taste is I like the way the fabric feels when it's pre-washed. So it's one of those things where you experiment and you learn and you can change your mind. So just enjoy. How can I best dry a quilt with wool batting? I don't have a dryer. You need to find something to lie it over so it can dry. You can put it on a clothesline outside. You can lay out towels and actually put it on a bed to dry. You do want to avoid the high heat with wool batting because it'll really shrink on you. So yeah, that's what I would do. I know you probably, if you don't have a dryer, you possibly don't have a big home. So I would go with towels on a bed and just lay it out and let it dry in the sunshine. Oh, we've got lots more people here. Karima Dawood from Richmond Hill, Ontario. Veronica Cuddy from Oshawa. Ipsy McQueen from Facebook has asked, I recently inherited a few kits that use muslin. Is this going to drive me crazy or offer a learning opportunity? Do you prep muslin, starch, iron before you starch? I'm not quite sure what kind of kit. I haven't seen it recently, but let's say 20 years ago and more, when they did paper piecing, instead of using paper, they used muslin, and they printed the pattern on the muslin, and the muslin stayed in the quilt. It just became a heavier quilt. And I don't know if that's what you're talking about. Do you prep muslin before you start? You just treat it the same way you would your regular fabrics. If you start your regular fabrics, start your muslin. And do you iron before you start? And that was one of my tips last week. Always iron your fabrics before you start. Pressed fabrics will cut so much nicer and straighter if they are pressed. Kathy Rask from Facebook has asked, what do I use for starch? I use flatter. It's technically not a starch. It's called a flattener. But what starch is that you've got those two grains of your fabric. You got the grains that go this way and the grains that go that way. And starch is just something that sits on top of it. And it provides, I call it scaffolding, just to hold it in place. So I will use starch when I'm using any seam that has an exposed bias. So if I'm making equilateral triangles, if I'm making those 45s in the kaleidoscope block, actually I think those are 22.5 at the top. Those ones I will always use starch. Don't use starch when I do the 2 at a time or 8 at a time HSTs. And there's a couple of reasons why. One, I find it slows me down. Two, I just don't think it's necessary. I can get accurate results without the starch. But there's people that starch everything. So it's, again, your own comfort level of how you like your fabrics to feel and how you like them to behave, and how many extra steps you want. So, but I definitely starch when I am using those open biased edges. Further to that is the next question. Any tips for cutting and assembling 60-degree triangles that I'm sewing into hexagons? So if you are sewing them, piecing them, I presume you're piecing them on a sewing machine. It sounds like you might be doing a one-block wonder. So this is my advice. You want to have, like on an equilateral triangle, those 60-degree ones, one will be on grain, one side will be on grain, the other two are going to be on the bias. So sew those two first. How we make, I have a piece of paper here, how for everyone else, how we make, so we have, let me just see here. So we have a triangle here, and then we'll have another triangle here, and then we'll have another triangle here. And then we sew it to the next one. We don't sew the whole hexagon together. We sew it to the next one like this. So if this is the grain and this is the straight of grain, then you've got a nice, secure strip going across that won't be stretchy. If you have these as your biased edge, then see the previous question, you need to have that starched ahead of time. One thing about starch that I didn't say, you want to starch your fabrics before you cut them. You want to have all that done because starch will shrink your fabrics and they'll be all out of size. So you press your fabrics at the beginning, you starch your fabrics at the beginning, and you wash your fabrics if that's your thing. And yeah, that's what I prefer. I know the people that made the One Block Wonder kit, they recommend pressing your seams open, but I just spin mine, and I find that works a lot better for me. I'm just that I'm a person who presses to the side. So, Paula Gardner has asked, can you recommend a quilt pattern for a beginner? For a person who's an absolute beginner, I think just making squares and rectangles and sewing strips in lines across your quilt to get the quilt the size that you want is the best thing that you should do. Start small. Either do a baby or a cuddle quilt. Please don't do a king like I did. It'll be tons of aggravation. You're going to learn so much when you're making that first quilt. And by using squares and rectangles, your quilting can actually be very simple too. So you're not into complicated patterns or anything when you come to quilt it. So that's what I would do. Squares and rectangles, make them in a long strip. The best size are between 4 inches and 5 inches. You could go up to 6. But once you get more than 6, things begin to stretch. Once you get smaller than 4, things begin to get... you need to be more accurate is really what it comes down to. So that's what I would do. Jessica has asked me from my crew, is there a pattern or block you recommend to learn curved seams? I have done a number of quilts with curved seams. I'm actually teaching one on the ship next month. And I'm teaching New York Beauty, but I don't think that's a beginner block. The first one I did was an orange peel. So an orange peel is not a full quarter circle. It's more of an angle, and you just get an orange peel shape. I don't know of any particular classes, but it's a lot easier than you think it is. Part of it, you just need to relax into it. Just practice a number on your practice pieces, your scraps, and you'll be doing it in no time. But since the crew, maybe I'll put a couple of curved ones in our sampler pattern that we're doing, and then I can show you in our monthly meetings. That's a good idea, Jessica. That's what I'll do. Jeannie Smith from YouTube. Is there a right or wrong size to start with for sashing? Horizontal or vertical? It's really a personal taste. I'm working on a video on borders, and normally you do the insides first, the vertical ones first, and then the horizontal ones are done second. But it's totally your taste. If they're all the same color, it's not going to really make a huge difference in the finished quilt. When you're getting into borders and sashing, though, the thing that you want is, if you can possibly do it, is cut them parallel to your selvage. I know if you've only got a yard of fabric and your border fabric or your sashing needs to be two yards long, you're making two pieces for that. But there's so much less stretch when you're working on that grain. Try to do that whenever you can. If you're cutting them with the fabric, there's a lot of stretch in that sashing, and you'll get wavy pieces, and it's harder to keep your pieces aligned. Okay. Is there a good rule of thumb for when we need to do a back stitch in piecing? I rarely do a back stitch. If you're using, like, I use a stitch about 2. Occasionally I go down to 1.8. But I find as long as I'm not manipulating my pieces a lot, I don't really need to worry about those stitches coming loose. But I know people do have issues with it, but it adds a lot of bulk in your seam when you do that back stitching there. And if you have a problem and you have to remove those stitches, it's so much harder, and it can damage those ends of the pieces. When you're at the ends of your quilt top, it's a good idea to put them there. A lot of long armors would like you to back stitch on those pieces so they don't have to do with any fabric coming undone. But I mean, you're talking to a person here who never does back stitching, and there's going to be people out there that do back stitching all the time. So it's just really, again, your own comfort level when and where you want to do it. Teresa Madigan. Trying to figure out where the accent is in your last name. I apologize. When quilting, have you ever knotted off the thread instead of burying it? Sometimes I do both. I'm trying to think of when I do the knot. I do the knot at the end, like I'm hand sewing my binding, in that very last stitch I will knot and tuck under. But most of the time I'm just burying them. Nancy has asked, do you ever think you'll do a Mississippi River cruise? I have asked about doing one of those, or one on Hood River. And my advice so far has been that they're very difficult to arrange and that they're expensive for what you get. So, but I really would like to do a Mississippi one. Phyllis Berg has asked, what do I need to know when backing a baby quilt with minky? I've never used it, and anything other than cotton for the back goes against every fiber in my being, no pun intended. Well, the problem with minky is that it stretches, right? And it's on the underneath of your work, so you can't actually see how well things are going through. Okay, so one thing when you're working with minky is to figure out what size is the less stretchy, and that's the one that you want on the longest side, parallel to to the longest line so it doesn't stretch as much as you're working with it. 2, baste it. If you either use spray baste or hand stitches or whatever to stop it from moving. I have a long arm, so I don't really need to worry about that extra stitching, but you just don't want it to move. And my personal opinion is you shouldn't be doing anything dense on minky. Like, it has a pile on it on the back, so you want that to stay up. So you're thinking big, nice, loopy loop-de-loops and bubbles and things like that. Don't worry about getting anything tiny. There is an issue when you're sewing on your binding because it's really hard to get deep. If you're sewing, like if you're hand sewing your binding on from the to the back, it's hard to get down into that pile and pull it up. So I would almost do it the reverse way. I would machine bind it, sewing the binding onto the back first and then pulling it forward. I think I saw somebody ask, should you put batting in when you do minky? I did an experiment a couple of months ago, and I did a minky just on its own. I did a minky with a flannel, and I did a minky with a batting. And my favorite one was the one with the flannel in it. The one with the batting in it wasn't too bad, but I presumed, if I'm thinking of what the purpose of the baby quilt would be, it's something that you wanted to pick up quickly and pull, and just maybe throw over the baby while they're in the car seat or in the stroller and things like that. And I just thought the batting one was just a little bit too bulky for that. The one without the batting I found like very limp. But if you're in a cool climate, that may be what you're looking for. It was very, very lightweight. It didn't seem to have the body that I liked from it. But there's a lot of people that don't put anything in their quilts when they use minky. So again, you can start with making some small patches and just figure out which one you prefer. I'm just looking through here. Carol Shoemake has said, I just received a jelly roll from a well-known site online. It was not wrapped, and one side is very, very badly fraying. How best to address it? Well, jelly rolls are notoriously bad. They fray and they fray and they fray. A lot of people talk about taking the jelly roll thing, and before you even take the string off it, you take your lint brush to it and try and pick up as much of the lint as possible. If the fraying is so bad that you do not have 2.5 inches, like it's gone in past the seam allowance and everything, I would talk to them about it. Explain that it didn't come with wrapping on it, and if you don't ask, you don't get. So if you really feel the quality of the fabric is not up to snuff, you pay a premium for a jelly roll. Don't know whether you bought it on sale or in the clearance bin, but if you paid full price, you want every single stitch of that. So I would go back to the vendor and talk to them about it. Lisa Johnson 678 on YouTube would like to know about thread. Can you elaborate on what you love, use, and don't recommend? All those spools of thread that you inherited from your mother, your aunt, your grandmother, or whatever, don't use them. If they're on wooden spools, they're beautiful. Think of some quilting project, like an art project or something, you can incorporate them in, but you do not want to use that thread in your quilt. Likewise, any quilt thread, I've realized, and I see it, does not last, has a lifespan. We, in our sewing machines, are not using under super tension, but people who do thread painting, people who use a serger or are just doing piecework, they need strong thread, and an older thread may not last. In my quilts, I use 100% cotton when I'm piecing, and I use polyester when I'm quilting. It's just because the cones that I buy are polyester. I've committed, so I am. But I do prefer to use cotton spools when I piece. And I usually get either the spaghetti from Wonderfill, or I get the Aurifil. They're not called mini cones. What are they called? Gotta look up that spool name. But they're just they're not the 100 yard, they're the 500 yard, or 5,000. I need to grab one. Let me see. And I grab an this is not that. This is their designer. Does it say 500 feet? All purpose. But the polyesters that we have today are very different from the polyesters that we used as young people or our parents used. Polyesters today have a very nice, they call it cottonized. There's some texture to it. They're soft. The thing that you want from your thread, you want to hold your layers together, hold your piecing together, but you also need it to be soft. Those are the two main things you need from your thread. And as your thread gets smaller, in cotton, it gets weaker. But polyester is still strong. That's why you find more polyesters in those higher numbers, like the 100 weight and the 80 weight. They're almost all polyesters. But likewise, when you go the other way, when you want them thicker and heavier, that's where cotton is king on that side of and the sweet spot in the middle is the 50 weight, and polyester and cotton both work well. Okay, we are at a time check of 30 minutes here. While we're at this 30-minute mark, let me just, in case you didn't know, last week I did a video on some 12 tips that you can implement right away to improve your blocks. Just little things that I accumulate over time, and there's certain ones that I do absolutely every time. It's amazing the difference that some of those tips can make a difference. Then this is the chippy chains. You can see over here, I also reversed one of my blocks, which of course I never noticed until I looked at it on the thumbnail, but it is correct now. I need to change the thumbnail. I did make the effort to change it. And then I dove deep into the disappearing 9 patch, and I showed you 3 different ways that you can make it. And then you mentioned the Mississippi ride. I am speaking at Festival of the Quilts in Birmingham, UK this year. An opportunity arose and I decided to jump on it. You can use this QR code right here to take you to where you can buy tickets. I'm doing 2 lectures. One is 535 and the other one's 542. One is on symmetry and one is on being the best quilter you can be. I am going to Indonesia this fall. We've got a good group of people together and we have 2 more spots left before we're at capacity. So if you'd like to do that, that would be wonderful. And just so next year in 2026, I'm going to be doing a cruise called the Best of Japan. We're just getting the final things done on it, but you can go to my website and pre-register, and the people who are pre-registered, of course, get first dibs on the ship, on the spots. So sign up if you're just even curious. And then I had a couple of really nice interviews on the podcast. Carla Rivard, she runs the Quebec Quilt Registry. and there's an awful lot of work that she and her team do to register blocks and create this archive for research and study for generations to come. And I discovered a couple of years ago that we have here in Ontario, it was called the Buxton Settlement, and it was one of the end stops on the Underground Railway. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Michelle Robbins, who is now the head person at the museum, and she is a descendant of people who were enslaved and escaped to Canada. And well, I mentioned it with Jessica, but if you are a member of my crew, and that's just subscribing to the channel, it's there right beside the join button. It is $5 US and $5.99 Canadian to join, just by month. And we are having not only our monthly stitch and chats, we are also having a class, and we are doing a sampler quilt this year. It's 10 months and 50 blocks to improve your quilting skills. What I like is it's such a wonderful, intimate group that when somebody's having a problem, I can jump in and just do a short video to explain any issues they have. We meet just before the monthly stitch and chat, and it's recorded. So if you can't make it, you can see it at other times. The first one was on squares and rectangles, and the second one was on HSTs, and we are going to be working on some flying geese this coming month, sorry. And yeah, so if you are interested in improving your quilting skills, check out Karen's Quilt Crew. And those videos are going to be there for members. We also had 2 classes last year that they're available for you to look at as well. One was on English paper piecing, and one was on paper piecing, foundation paper piecing. So those are available as well. So Jessica, you cannot, you got to choose between the high school graduation and the trip, but that would be lovely if you could join us. If you ever visit Indonesia, you should come visit Australia next by Christine. I do need to get to Australia again. It's been a long time since I've been there. When I lived there, so many people, their vacation place was Bali. So it's been lovely to take a look at Bali and see all the wonderful places to go. So the next question is Paul Prilby says, my sewing room is in a mold and mildew-free basement. Should I be concerned about humidity when sewing? Well, I think you were probably the best judge of that with humidity. There's those little silicone things that we get with all sorts of electrical equipment and things like that. It's just a desiccant that absorbs moisture. You could throw a couple of those in instead of throwing them out. Throw them into your clothing piles. If it's a mold and mildew free, how would mold and mildew get in then? If it's a moist basement, I could see there being a problem, but if it's dry, I don't think you have to worry about it unless you have things that go from a moist area into your area and they're in a sealed container, you know, those big Rubbermaid containers, or something with a seal on it, and that moisture can hang out there. So that is. Mary Cootenham has asked, have you ever replaced a binding without removing the old damaged binding? No, I haven't. But I can see that you wouldn't have to remove all of it. Like if it's deteriorating and it's falling off, you just want to remove the bulk of it. You don't have to get down with your stitch ripper, and just use a generous binding when you're doing the next level. If you don't want to even do that, you would just have to use a bigger binding piece. That's all. Depending on what you're starting with, if it's small, probably 2.5 inches is probably good to get over. But if it's still a fairly bulky one, you're going to have to do a couple of tests on what size um, you want to use. I've made a little library for myself. I've just taken small pieces of binding, and I just experimented with different sizes of binding. Sorry, I took 2 pieces of fabric and batting, and then I put binding over one of the edges. And I just experimented. I started with 1.5 inch binding, like 1.5 inch strips to see what I could get. And I went all the way up to 1.5 inches, 1.5 inch size finished. And I think I needed a 6.5 inch piece of binding for that. So yeah, experiment if you want. If you really don't want to take off that old binding, I don't think you have to. You just have to take a little test drive with a couple of pieces to see whether you like that bulk or not. You may try putting it on the other way. Like if the binding that you have right now is sewn to the front, you might try sewing yours to the back and flipping it over. Yeah. JD Tucker has asked, I'm making my first quilt sandwich and I live in an apartment. What is the best way to lay out everything when space is limited? Use your bed. Make your bed. Make sure you have a flat surface. But if you are sandwiching your quilt, do it on the wall. I live in a condo, and I used to do it in the fire escape in the wall, and it worked lovely, and it was out of the way. The only thing you have to be sure of is that if you're using spray base, that you're in a ventilated area. Sometimes you spray base the batting outside and then bring it in and spread it on the wall afterwards. Velvet Stitching says, what do you think of quilting as you go as a technique for a baby blanket? I think it's excellent. I do it all the time. I've got 2 videos, Quilt as you go #1 and Quilt as you go #2. 2 different methods. One is with bias binding. The other one is with stitch and flip. So, and I'm, I know there's at least 2 other methods out there. So if you want to do Quilt as you go with a baby blanket, go for it. Missy, don't you find that your sewing machine is really dusty after piecing with cotton? Yes, it is. Very dusty, and that's why I clean it every day. And I put a drop of oil in it every day that I use it. Yeah, it's amazing. The fluff just kind of flies away. And I have one little spot in between my my bobbin case and its housing that it makes these small, tiny little balls. I've almost thought of making a collection of these little tight little balls that it makes all the time. But yeah, very, very dusty. And when you work with scraps, it gets even worse because you got the fluff coming off the fabric and all over the floor and everywhere in yourself. So quilting often is not a clean hobby. Marsha Weber says, I inherited a Texas Star UFO that was started by my great-grandma. It has stretched out of shape in areas. I hate to throw away her work, but I don't know how to fix it. Suggestions? Well, often these quilt tops that you inherited were never put into quilts because there was a problem with it. And I understand the sentiment of trying to keep something of your grandmother's. I've got something like that too. But what you can do, I interviewed a wonderful woman who worked with antique pieces all the time. And what she said was, don't take the whole thing. Just take a section of it, finish that off, put a binding on it, and frame it. That way you have something concrete. You still have the sentiment there. You still honor the maker, but you don't have this Herculean task of trying to fix their mistakes. I have a quilt top there that is, the sashing and the borders are all just terrible. And the truth is, it's not worthy of being made into a quilt. It's just not good enough to be made into a quilt. But there's no problem with taking one of the squares and turning that into a pillow or turning that into something that can be framed and put on the wall. Do I have any tips for getting a small checkerboard block to be neat with points line up? A best method. I press using a 50 weight thread and use a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance. Well, I nest my seams. I would refer you to the video that I just made because everything I'm going to say I put in that video. If your blocks are perfectly square and you're using a consistent 1/4 inch seam and you're nesting your seams and things like that, everything should be working okay. It could be the size. I mentioned at the beginning, when you start going down in size, things become tricky. I don't actually know the pattern that you're using, whether you're repeating fabrics. Sometimes it's easier to sew your fabric in a long strip and cut it up and then sew those pieces together, because when you're sewing a small piece to another small piece, it's very easy for them to get cockeyed. Use that ledge to help keep your everything straight, and just keep on that accuracy of that 1/4 inch. Just make sure that it's bang on every time you sit down. And if you're finding things aren't lining up, try and take a look at it again. Like, is there something going wrong there? I did a class with Mary Elizabeth Kinch, sewing down small, like we're talking 1 inch squares, and threads matter. Like where before, when you're making a bigger, like I'm talking about those 5 inch beginner squares, if it's your 1/4 inch off by a 1/16, the fabric and everything will compensate for it. When you're down at 1 inch, you don't have threads to spare. It's got to be bang on, and all your technique has to be bang on. So try working with 4 patches and making sure that they're square, and then sew those to the other, and make sure you've got an ironing plan so you've got everything going in the right direction. And I think that's all I can offer you in a Q&A. But they're harder than you think they are, because the accuracy just has to be there every single time. You cannot take your eyes off, your focus off the technique for a second, because then things will not line up. Hazel Whiteman has asked, will you teach an online class on your Capella cluster? Yes, I am. It's going to be coming this summer. Cora Beth Ferguson has asked, I recently came across your tips on ironing and not swishing when ironed. I messed up and made several blocks that I realized now that is a problem. Can they be saved, and how? Not really. Once they've been pushed out of square, there's not much you can do. If they're bigger, you can trim them down to be the right size. If they're shorter, you can just mark where the seam allowance should be and use a smaller seam allowance, but sometimes they're too small for that. I would recommend just making them again. Patrice Lesage says, I inherited fabric that smells very musty. Any tricks for getting the smell out, or should I just toss it? You may not be wanting to put the effort that you need to make musty fabrics unmusty. Basically, you have to kill the mold, and that involves sunlight. So you want to get them out into the sun. You want to bake them in the sun, and then give them a wash and see whether it's still there. Yeah, and go from there. John has just asked, how's his god dog? Mando. And for anyone that doesn't know the story, I was taking John's pet portrait class, and the next day I had a new dog. I just was missing my old dog so badly. And Mando's doing quite well right at the moment. We're just investing. He's had a sore leg for a little while. We keep trying. It gets a little better, but then it doesn't quite heal. So we're just going through the steps now with the vet, trying to figure out what's his issue. Whew, it's 45 minutes. Boy, I can talk. Diane Ferguson has asked, do I use an AccuQuilt? If so, what are my favorite dyes? No, I don't use an AccuQuilt. I have a friend that uses one. She swears by it. She can no longer cut with her hands. They're too arthritic, and it's really good for her. I don't use it mainly because I really enjoy cutting fabric. It's one of my favorite parts of the process. And I love the math. I love figuring out how to do it easily. I like making jigs so it's nice and smooth and fast. And I really don't want the clutter that AccuQuilt will bring into my space. As you say, there's not only the machine, there's all the dyes to go with it. And I just didn't want that extra management. And that's one reason why I didn't go down the Cricut rabbit hole as well. I did go down the embroidery the embroidery module rabbit hole, and it's amazing how much stuff that brings in. Sorry, I've got my friends here, my dog walking friends. Mimi Sewing Station has asked, how do you decide what border to put in a quilt? Well, I'm just going to ask you to hang tight because I am working on a video about borders now. I now have some quilts that I can put borders on, and yeah, I'm just in the process of making that video, so it's coming in a couple of weeks. What's that on free motion quilting with a stitch regulator? Are they necessary? Well, stitch regulators are attachments that you add, or they're built into your machine. So when you're moving your fabric around, there's a laser eye or something that can measure the motion and equalize the stitches so that they're all the same size. I have one on my Berninas, my new Berninas, but I don't do a lot of free motion quilting anymore, but it certainly made it a lot easier. I do have a stitch regulator on my long arm, and I use it all the time. I very rarely not use it. I use it when I do pantographs. I use it when I do free motion quilting. Now, I know when I was with Tracy Russell of Whirls and Swirls, she was telling me about not using the stitch regulator when she was doing certain motions. She just was able to maintain a constant speed with her hand, because we often go speed around and then stop, and then speed around and then stop. And that's just a different technique, and I just have not had the time to get any expertise in that way. So I'm very happy with my stitch regulators. They keep me honest. Okay, so I think, we've got one last question here. Lydia, decisions, making the seams nest and then have them showing through the lighter background fabric, or have lumpy seams where everything is pressed to the darker side and visually appealing. Okay, one thing that people have to remember is that you are making a quilt. There's going to be 3 layers, and all that bump that you see, a lot of it is going to get lost into the batting, and it's not going to be an issue. Yes, if you work with white, you do have to be careful of dark fabric showing through. I think white on white, it doesn't really matter too much, but you've got quilting to go on top of it. Nobody's going to be staring and looking at the white on white fabric. So, but again, it's a personal taste. If you're doing white on white, I have a video on all the challenges when you use white fabric. And one of them is to use a bright white batting underneath it, but you want your fabric to be flat and you want your quilt top to be square, but even that one is debatable sometimes. But a lot of that extra bulk is going to be lost once you make it into a quilt sandwich and you quilt it. Yeah. I've never had anybody complain to me, "Ooh, this is too lumpy." Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I appreciate all the community. As I always say, we've got the best people in this community. I wish we could just send the great vibe out there into the bigger world. There's not going to be a video this week, but there will be one next week. And I've got a number of really good podcasts coming. I've interviewed some really, really good people. Not that I haven't mentioned my last ones haven't been great, but I've got some good ones coming. So thank you everyone for coming. As always, just send in your questions, and some of them that we get via email, we will answer in the Q&A, and if not, they go into the great big pool of Q&As, like video plans. So thank you all for